So the other day I saw this newspaper article that talked about these three volleyball players from Honolulu High School. And in the article it talked about how they're all choosing to go to the University of Hawaii at Manoa to play volleyball. And when I first saw that article, I was kind of shocked because I was thinking to myself, well, they're pretty good players. Why would they stay in Hawaii? Why would they pick UH to go play volleyball? And then I remembered that actually UH is quite good at men's volleyball. They won the last 2 national championships and are looking to add a 3rd this season. And so it got me thinking, how can we make Hawaii more attractive for the best and the brightest of our local kids to want to stay? And I'm not saying that all kids should stay in Hawaii, but I think if we can make it so that there's just not this attitude of, why would I stay in Hawaii? By the way, Moana Lua, I was cheering for you guys, man. It's okay. You guys get Punahou next year. Okay, the first thing is Hawaii has to become leaders in more industries. The alternatives cannot just be construction, tourism, and retail restaurants. We gotta have more than just that here. And instead of just complaining, I got 3 suggestions on some industries that Hawaii could really pursue and perhaps attract local talent to want to go in those industries. The first is agriculture. And before you think, oh my gosh, are you suggesting that we go back to plantation days? That's not what I'm suggesting. And yes, we have macadamia nuts and coffee, and that's nice. And we are growing on a smaller scale to certain local produce. But what I'm talking about here is to really invest in alternative farming methods, particularly vertical farming. And maybe for the average person, farming is where you just plow the field and you do a lot of hard work out in the sun, you plant the crops, and then after a certain time you go and harvest those crops with machinery or you pull by hand. But what I'm talking about here is incorporating more of modern day technology into farming techniques that we can really take advantage of here in Hawaii. Because when we talk about vertical farming, it doesn't involve a lot of space. In fact, we could do it in some of these buildings like they do in places like Japan. Of course, we also have a lot of natural sunlight year-round, which will help, but I know that with vertical farming, a lot of it relies on electricity. And fortunately, we have a big solar industry here where we can use alternative sources of energy to power agriculture. On top of that, these buildings and structures are gonna take a lot of construction. And so to me, something like vertical farming can incorporate science, it can incorporate clean energy, it can incorporate construction, all of that hopefully to make it so that Hawaii can start growing its own food. And not just crops that we sell off, but crops that local people actually would like to eat. Okay, second industry, astronomy. Now I know this one might be kind of controversial. I understand Mauna Kea, the observatories, and that whole deal happening on Big Island as well as what's going on Maui at Haleakala. But really, Hawaii is in a great position to be somewhat of a leader in astronomy because there's not that many places in the world that have access to the sky like we do here. And rather than go into the whole discussion about the telescopes and removing them and all of that, I just want to bring up the unique position that Hawaii is in to be able to fuse science and culture. And that's not necessarily something that is common worldwide. I'm always amazed that people were able to navigate based on the stars. And if you think about that and what we can learn from Native Hawaiians and how they used to navigate, and still to some extent today navigate. And I think modern astronomy can take some of those pointers. I also think it would be great to see young locals, particularly Native Hawaiians, get into astronomy because they can bring some of that cultural background and their personal cultural heritage into a modern day science and maybe bridge that gap so that there's not this necessarily big social cultural divide. I know this young man who's going to the mainland for college and he's going to major in astrophysics, and I know nothing about that, but I told him that that's amazing, and after you graduate with that degree you should come back home because there actually are jobs here on the Big Island and even to some extent on Oahu where you could use that astrophysics background and you could be a native Hawaiian astronomer. And the third industry I'd love to see us expand upon more is alternative energy research. Now, of course, I know there's solar and people got to use solar here and saw their electricity bills go down to like $17 a month when they run the AC all day. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about alternatives to better those types of technologies. We have access to geothermal, wind, and wave energy. And because our state is in a position to have access to all of these types of alternative sources of energy, why not become one of the leaders in research so that what people learn here, because they have access to it so readily, they can take elsewhere throughout the world. And I would be remiss without mentioning at least nuclear energy. Now, I know people are thinking, are you crazy? Nuclear energy in Hawaii? I think we tend to have this sort of fear about nuclear energy, but it could be a possibility. I'm not saying to build a nuclear reactor here. I'm just saying that possibly it could be an alternative for us in the future. Believe it or not, it's one of the most reliable sources of energy. It's somewhat clean, somewhat. And there are already over 90 nuclear power plants in the US today. Now, I know, there's always that fear and the idea of the nuclear waste, but imagine if a nuclear power plant in Hawaii could reduce the electricity bill for people throughout the state. I mean, really do it to where our electricity bills could go from the highest in the country to reasonable, or to put it in more real terms, let's say it was $50. Your electricity bill in Hawaii, running the AC all the time and doing laundry and all the things that you do, right? And your electricity bill could be $50. And it might make you think maybe nuclear energy is not that bad. The second thing I'd like to see more done throughout the state to attract and keep local talent is to market the current industries that we have a little bit better. I feel like we often market the tourism stuff as this is what you just do after you graduate high school or in college. I don't know what you're gonna do, but you can go work retail. I think we need to do a better job of communicating, and not just at job fairs, but just in general, communicating what alternatives there are in terms of career paths if you do decide to stay here and aren't going into your general construction, or I'm gonna go work retail or go work at a hotel. Again, nothing wrong with those industries, but I think if it was better known what other possibilities there are that are high-paying jobs, good-paying jobs, then local kids might be more prone to staying. So of course there's fields like engineering, and I know we turn out a lot of local engineers, and then of course, they got the ring on, and that's wonderful. But I'm also talking about promoting the trades, plumbing or ironwork or welding, things like that are actually quite useful and don't necessarily get promoted as good paying jobs. And maybe that's on the local unions to try to promote, but it would be wonderful to see some local kids stay and be interested in these fields, because although they're not necessarily the most glamorous jobs like doctor, lawyer, architect, we desperately need them. There's also opportunities with the federal and local governments here. You can go work shipyard. I did for one summer, and it was a really good opportunity. I don't think a lot of people know about their apprenticeship program, which is tied in with the local community colleges. And my last suggestion would be to build some kind of local pipeline with former Hawaii residents who work on the mainland to provide opportunities, or at least advertise opportunities, to give local kids a chance to work remote for some of these mainland companies. Now, I'm not suggesting that they only hire local kids to go work at some of these companies. I mean, they have to be competitive and their resume should speak of their qualifications. But I know that we have local people who were born and raised here, who moved away to the mainland, who could, in their position, potentially look at some local candidates. And if there was only a way that we could connect some of these former Hawaii residents to some of the current workforce here, then maybe they could hire some local kids and they wouldn't have to move away. They could still get jobs in industries that maybe we don't have here. And if you're from Hawaii, you know that there's this special bond that local people have with each other. And I think we should try to find ways to utilize that connection and that bond with people who have moved elsewhere. And if they're looking for ways to connect with Hawaii or to give back, I think this would be a wonderful opportunity to be able to go and do that. But I do know that this discussion brings up the question of whether we should be trying to keep local kids in Hawaii. And that's a whole nother question, a whole nother topic for another video. Because while it would be nice to keep local kids here, more local kids here, I know that not all people want to stay in Hawaii. I've been there. I went to the mainland. I wanted to go to the mainland after high school. I didn't want to stay here for another 4+ years. I wanted to try my luck on the mainland, and it was one of the best decisions that I made. Of course, I was super scared. I didn't know anybody, but I grew up and I was able to experience so many things that we just don't have here in Hawaii. Because it's NBA basketball season, one of those opportunities that I recall was being able to sit courtside at the Pepsi Center. Fortunately, my roommate's dad worked for Pepsi, so that's how I was able to do that. There's no way I could have watched the Denver Nuggets play courtside if I was here in Hawaii. At best, we have exhibition games, but I don't have access to those kinds of opportunities. By the way, sitting courtside and in a luxury box, whew, boy, it's pretty nice. But besides that, I think it's important to examine whether we do want local kids to stick around. For me, I'd love to see more local kids stick around in the long term. Of course, go to the mainland, live a little bit, grow up, go to school, do what you gotta do elsewhere, and then come back. Bring what you learned from the mainland and come back here and help us to make all of this a better place. But more importantly, as a state, I just want us to provide younger people with a choice on whether or not they want to stay here. Because as things get more expensive and people start to look elsewhere, younger people start to look elsewhere, it sometimes feels like we're pushing the young kids to go away as if they don't have a choice. And I don't want it to be like this bittersweet moment where it's like, well, I would love to stay in Hawaii, but it's too expensive and there's no jobs. It's our job to try and change that, I think, for them. So if they do want to stay, at least they have a choice. And we're not, through circumstances, forcing these young and bright and best of us young locals to move. So I'd love to hear what people have to say about how we can really make Hawaii a better place that's more attractive to our future generations. Because whether or not you realize it, that young generation is what's gonna become our legacy. Of course, they're gonna be our tax base to pay for a lot of services for the growing elderly population, but it's more than just the tax base. It's really what we pass on. It's how our local culture gets passed on, because there is no written book about this is how you act when you're local. And while I was thinking about this topic, primarily the reasons how we could better Hawaii so that local kids would want to stay, I also did think about maybe some of the bad things we can do, or negative things, or maybe not so great things that we can do to keep local kids here as well. We could keep them undereducated so that they have no other choice but to stay here. We could keep them financially illiterate so that they don't understand how to manage their finances, and ultimately they can't leave because they can't afford to leave. Or we could always cultivate a culture that teaches them that other people will take care of them, like mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, or even the government, so that they never have to actually do anything and they'll be okay. Now, I know that sounds kind of bleak and that's not the point, but something to consider, that there are other ways to keep our local kids here. It's just those aren't necessarily for the better. So with that, would love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching, and aloha.